All right, thank you everyone. So glad everyone could join us tonight. We're excited to be kicking off the Grand Woodchip Tour, as it's called. Really excited to sort of celebrate the launch of Ben's book, the Woodchip Handbook, and also the start of a sort of month-long plus of woodchip focused events. So I'll post the rest of the tour, link to the rest of the tour as well later. But just a few housekeeping things. We are offering a discount code from our US and UK websites. So that is WEB35, and that's 35% off Ben's book. And I'll put the code in the link in the chat as well. And just to let you know, we're recording it. So if you have to pop out or do something else, we'll send you a link later. It'll be up on YouTube. So don't worry if you can't stay for the whole thing. Thank you everyone who sent in questions. That's really appreciated. And we will get to questions at the end of Ben's talk. I think we'll have about 20 minutes to get stuck into lots of woodchip related things at the end. So just quickly, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you have any questions. If you want to use the chat box, we'd love to know where you're listening in from, or if you have any comments, things like that, please put it in the chat box. And just before I hand over to Ben, for those of you that might not know him, Ben's worked in horticulture for more than 25 years, developing a wide range of experience, both in practical commercial growing and wider policy and advocacy work. He is the Soil Association's head of horticulture and agroforestry, and he provides growers at all levels of production with technical, marketing, policy, supply chain, all sorts of support. So he's also currently implementing a 200-acre silvopastoral agroforestry planting in Wiltshire, which I'm sure he'll tell you a bit about. And he's the author of several previous books and co-chairs the DEFRA Edibles Roundtable, and also sits on the board of Organic Growers Alliance and Community Supported Agriculture Network UK. So we're in good hands. He's got lots of experience, and he's the best person possible to tell you about woodchip. So I'll hand it over to you, Ben.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. Really pleased that so many other people interested in woodchip. I did wonder when I embarked on this whether I was slightly lunatic. I had two main reactions when I started working on it. One was, oh, woodchip, that's a bit niche, isn't it? And the other was, oh, I love woodchip. Yeah, I'm always using woodchip. So I kind of felt that probably it was worth pursuing with. As Rosie said, we did have a few questions come in advance, so I will try and cover some of those questions through the presentation, and if I don't get to them, hopefully we'll have time at the end. And one of the questions was from Danny, which was what got me into woodchip in the first place. And it was, I don't think there was one eureka moment necessarily, but it was a gradual drip of just seeing really interesting stuff that people were doing with woodchip. And then starting to realize that not a lot of people seem to be pulling all of that stuff together. And I will mention a few people because and they'll sort of come out during the presentation as well. So one is a grower called Ian Tolhurst, who some of you in the UK may already know, who's just an amazing grower. He's been around for decades, and he's been doing a lot with woodchip, certainly for 10, 12 years. And so I'd visited him a few times and seen some of the things he was doing, using woodchip on soil, using woodchip to make compost. So that was really influential. Through the work at the Soil Association, I also got involved in a couple of research projects on woodchip. One was with a tree researcher called Glyn Percival, who was doing some stuff on single species woodchip. And particularly we worked with him on a willow woodchip trial, looking at how using willow woodchip could potentially help reduce scab disease in apples. And then working with Sally Westaway at the Organic Research Centre on a ramial woodchip project and looking at the potential benefits to soil. So those were a few of the things to start with. There's another grower who's very near to where I live, called Fred Bonstrew, and he's using quite a lot of woodchip, not just for mulching, but he's developed this system of creating a hot box for propagation, which I'll cover later in the talk. And then reading the work of David Granitstein, who's a American researcher working on commercial orchards and mulching, and that really inspired me to look at the commercial potential of woodchip. And one of the things I love about my work is it spans the sort of gardening, commercial grower, farming. It sort of links all of that together. And I think sometimes when you work in just one area, it's quite easy not to find out about what's happening in the others. So I love the fact that I can bring some of this stuff together. And then the work that I'm doing at Eastbrook Farm, which is the agroforestry project Rosie mentioned, where we're planting up, well, initially anyway, planting up about 200 acres of agroforestry. So planting lots of trees and using a lot of wood chip. And I'll show you a photo in a bit, which was, I think, if there was one eureka moment, not there really was, but if there was, it was seeing the result of an accidental experiment we did there. So that was my inspiration, and just looking at it and thinking, right, we're not really using wood chip as much as we could. So where does wood chip come from? Well, wood, obviously, but wood chip is a relatively recent invention in one sense. So the very first wood chipper was invented in 1884, so it's only 140 years old, by Peter Jensen in Marsball in Germany, and he invented it to deal with the prunings from the parks. So then, as now, people had to, cut down trees, and they didn't know what to do with it. So history doesn't tell us what he did with the wood chips. Presumably just put them somewhere. The company still exists, so they're still making wood chippers in Germany. They're quite a big manufacturer. So we haven't had that long to work out what to do with wood chip, I guess. In theory, any part of the tree can be chipped or shredded, if you've got the right machinery. One of the questions that Danny asked, if you could make it without the machinery, without a chipper. So, I mean, in theory, you can deal with relatively small quantities just in your garden with secateurs, pair of loppers, chopping it up small. So, so wood, if you've got a piece of wood, it will rot down from where the cut ends are. So the shorter you make the bits, the quicker it will rot down. Or if you've got slightly bigger bits, you can get a sledgehammer and smash it on the concrete. So there are ways you can deal with woody waste, but it's quite slow, I would say, and particularly if you've got, if you're trying to do it with secateurs or loppers or things, you're quite likely to end up with repetitive strain injury, I suspect. So I think in most cases, probably a machine is the way to go. And I haven't got time to go into the range of machinery tonight, but there's some stuff in the book. But there's very small garden shredders which can deal just with very small stuff, right up to these enormous beasts that can deal with whole trees, which are slightly awesome in a kind of scary kind of way. I would say mostly, unless you've got a lot of trees to chip, I would say you're much better off hiring a chipper to do it for you, or either hiring the chipper and doing it yourself, or hiring someone in to chip it for you. You can hire a much bigger machine and chip it much more quickly than buying a smaller one. And there was also a question around the sustainability and the amount of fuel that you might use, which I have thought about. There's not really very much research into it. My gut feeling probably is that the amount of fuel used in chipping is relatively small compared to the benefit. I think if I had to choose two machines that if you were weeding out which machinery to get rid of in the world, I think I'd keep a chainsaw and a wood chipper, just because it's so hard to achieve the same results without those. But yeah, I'd love to have more figures to back up the system, and it depends a little bit, I guess, as well, in terms of where the wood chip's coming from. If it's to be dealt with anyway, if it's coming from an urban environment where the wood has to be disposed of in one form or another, then it's probably still pretty sensible. If you could just leave it where it lies and let it rot down, then it might not be so sensible. But yeah, we don't have the figures, but it does clearly take some energy, and maybe at some point we'll have electric chippers all running from renewable energy, although clearly still carbon embedded in the manufacture. So that's where wood chip comes from. So where can you get it? In small quantities, most garden centres will sell little bags of 80 litres or 100-litre bags, and in the UK that tends to cost about £10. So it's quite an expensive way of buying it, but clearly in some situations, if you don't have a driveway where you can sort of tip large amounts, that might be the only way to get hold of it. You can also quite often buy these ton bags or tote bags. Again, they're sort of in the UK, they tend to start at about £60 from a bag, although clearly some people also see a way of making a quick buck. I've seen that 2 or 3 times that price, but that's a much more effective way of getting it, and still quite manageable even for small gardens. If you've got bigger gardens or a driveway, then potentially you can get free wood chip from tree surgeons. So in the UK, there's an organisation called ArbTalk. In the US, there's one called Chip Drop, that you can register as a site, a tip site. So often tree surgeons will have to pay to get rid of their wood chip, and if they can sort of dump it somewhere free near to where they've been working, that's much more helpful. So certainly that's what we do at the farm. We've got 2 local tree surgeons who give us their wood chip, so we get quite a lot of free wood chip. But we've got a big concrete pad, and it's easy to dump it. There's also power companies where they're clearing along the lines. This is, I think, more relevant in the USA, but there is some potential in the UK with this. So they have to keep cutting back the trees to keep the power lines clear, and quite a lot of them will offer free chip either to their customers or to people sort of near where they're clearing. And again, you'd normally have to contact the company and register with them. Some have quite a formal process where you sort of fill in a form and register. Others, it's a bit more informal. The other option would be to grow your own. So this is top left here is an example. It's an agroforestry farm called Wakelands in the east of England, where they're actually coppicing it mainly for biomass for their boiler, but they have also done some ramial wood chip experiments. So if you want to grow your own and you've got enough land, then having an efficient system to do that makes sense. So here they've got effectively a two cut rotation, so they've always got some benefit from the trees, and they'll harvest one year and the other the following year. And there's various species that you can use like that, and we can talk a little bit more about species in the Q&A if people are interested. So clearly there's some, there's advantages and disadvantages to all of these. One of the questions I get about the tree surgeons wood chip is the risk of disease from bringing in, what potentially is diseased wood, because a lot of the trees that tree surgeons will be taking down are likely to be old or dying or diseased. There is a small risk. I was initially, when I started, I was a bit nervous about all of that stuff. I've become more relaxed about it. I think mostly these tree diseases will attack older and weaker trees, and mostly when you're using wood chip as a mulch or soil amendment, you're adding it either to young trees or to non-tree species. So I think the risk of contaminating with disease is very low, but also if you're composting wood chip first, then that will actually kill off most of the diseases anyway. So my feeling is that actually the risk from disease is pretty low. The only thing you've got to be a bit careful about if you're mulching trees is make sure that the mulch doesn't touch the actual trunk, because that can cause a bit of a it keeps it damp and it can cause rotting on the trunk, but otherwise the risk is pretty low. So if we start with mulches, and I think mulches are probably the most understood use of wood chip. Often I think people will use them on paths because they work really well on paths, and they're sometimes nervous about using them on plants. I hope you'll be less nervous about using them on plants at the end of tonight. So I thought I might just go through a few of the uses or a few of the benefits that mulch can bring, wood chip mulch can bring. So I'll go through. So obviously controls weeds, holds water in, can modulate temperature. This sort of protection of the soil surface from presenting splash is one that I think not everyone is aware of. And the final one for tree planting certainly is vole control, which is perhaps slightly surprising. So you will all, I'm sure, be aware of the fact that a mulch will control weeds. And there's various ways it does that, assuming that it's deep enough. And in the research I've seen, it needs to be at least 10 centimeters, 10 to 15 centimeters deep. So, 4 to 6 inches deep. And what it does, the main thing it does is it prevents light getting through to the soil. So that stops weeds germinating and growing. That's the main mechanism. But also what it can do is inhibit germination for seeds that land after it's been put down. So typically, and this works particularly well if it's a fresh wood chip mulch as opposed to a composted one, if a weed seed lands on a lump of wood, that's not a great place for it to grow. It's going to sit there and dry out, and typically you will get almost no germination of seeds on a wood chip mulch. As it composts and becomes more like soil, then it becomes more attractive to weed seeds. So when you've got a material, you're always going to be weighing up, what's the best use for that material. So composted wood chip is great for, putting into soil where you're worried about nitrogen robbing, for instance, but it's not so great for controlling germination of seeds. The final mechanism that helps to control weeds is that quite a lot of wood chip species or wood tree species have chemicals in them that can inhibit germination, this allelopathic effect, as it's called. So for instance, walnut has a substance called juglone, which has been shown to inhibit germination. As the wood chip mulch compost, that effect decreases. So it's the fresher the wood chip, the more likely it is to keep it weed free. Particularly where you're sort of using it around trees where they've got deep roots and you're not worried about that nitrogen robbing, which we'll come on to again. So most wood chip is useful, but it's not always useful in the same situation. So it's worth thinking about the material that you've got and how best to use it. The other thing just to say is the wood chip is not very good at controlling perennial weeds. So what you see here is a lovely picture where we had a nice weed-free bed, which then this creeping thistle crept through, as it does. And of course, once it gets through the mulch, it's got this lovely bare earth. It's got no competition. Nothing else is growing there. So suddenly you've created this lovely moist, fertile bed for perennial weeds. And this particular bed ended up quite quickly looking like that. This is at the farm. So this is a strip of trees that we planted. And as you can see, fairly smothered by the flowering and seeding thistle. I'm not as worried as you might think by that, actually. The trees will survive and come through it. And this is an amazing habitat for birds. So there's flocks of goldfinches come over here in the winter, and it's glorious. So as long as a farmer, as long as you're not too worried about having a messy farm, then some of these things are not as big a problem as you might think. We just have to fight against our desire for tidiness sometimes. So this is the accidental experiment that I mentioned earlier. And one of the big things that mulches do is hold water in. Typically, a 15 centimetre deep mulch might hold in 25% more water in the soil, or reduce your irrigation need by about a quarter. And this picture here, the trees that you can see on the left and the trees on the right were planted on exactly the same day. And the ones on the right, we were pollarding some willow, so cutting back some willow quite hard, and we chipped a whole load of wood, and I threw it over the fence, meaning to spread it all out and going and mulch the other trees, and we never got round to it. So the trees on the right had about a 2-foot layer of mulch on them, and this was in 2018, which in the UK was a really hot, dry year. We had almost no rain most of the spring and summer. So the trees on these are willow trees. All of them are in the foreground are willow trees, and the ones on the left here they're still not much higher than my waist, and the ones on the right are now about 12 foot tall. As I say, all of them planted on the same day, and that was what made me really appreciate the power of woodchip. And I think the main mechanism here, was water retention. There may have been some other benefits, but because of the year, I think that's what the difference was. Now, in a wetter year, you may not have seen quite such a striking difference. And, of course, we can't mulch every tree we've got with a 2-foot mulch, even if we wanted to. It would cost too much and take too long, and I'm not even sure where we'd find the material. But it was just quite interesting, quite how much it made them grow. The other thing that I wasn't so aware of until I started researching for the book was this temperature modulation effect that mulches give. So most plants, as you'd expect, most plants don't thrive in extremes of temperature. And similarly, most soil organisms are most active at around sort of 25, 30 degrees centigrade or 75, 85 degrees Fahrenheit. That's what they like. So the hotter, when it gets really hot, fungi particularly struggle, and when it gets really cold, bacteria really struggle. So you want to try and keep the temperature in that middle zone, and putting a good mulch down will help do that. So in really cold weather, a mulch soil can be up to 10 degrees warmer, and in really hot weather, the soil will be much slower to heat up than if it's unmulched. So you can really make a difference to that soil temperature. So preventing splash, so bare soils, I'm sure you've all been out in a really heavy rainstorm, and we definitely seem to be getting more of those with climate change. And when the rain, and particularly when big droplets of rain hit the soil, they splash up. So you quite often see around plants, you'll see that they're splattered with mud. And one of the things that does, not only does it sort of make them a bit wetter and more likely to be diseased, but there's also lots of disease spores within that mud, which then get transferred onto the leaves of the plants. And if you put a good mulch, I mean, any organic mulch really works on this, but woodchip is effective. Effectively, when those big drops hit, they either just get absorbed into the mulch, or even if they do splash, it's splashing off a clean wood rather than this sort of dirty mix of soil. And there was one trial in the States looking at box hedges, which are particularly prone to this box blight. And with a mulch, they showed a 97% decrease in the disease. So just almost eliminated it by using a mulch. Now, some of that may have been also increased health of the plant and vigor from all of those other things we talked about, but they're pretty certain that most of it was to do with the splash. And even if you're not worried about splashing onto plants, putting a mulch down on compacted areas or damaged areas or areas where you've got a lot of traffic can really help just protect that soil surface. So in some of our gateways on the farm, we're using a good few inches of wood chip, and then even where we're taking tractors back and forth through the gate, it reduces the amount of damage and increases infiltration. So it's a really useful way of protecting the soil. So this little creature here, I mean, he looks all very innocent there, doesn't he? Munching away on his worm. But they can be absolutely devastating for trees, and particularly young trees. And we've experimented with a whole range of different mulching techniques. So we've used mulch mats, with both Hessian ones and plastic ones. And what that seems to do, it seems to create this lovely dry little vole hotel. And then if you put something on top of that, so we've tried it with the Hessian mat and then wood chip on top, and that's even worse because that's an insulated hotel for the vole. So they love it. They crawl under there and they can just nibble at the roots whenever they want without being in any danger. Where we've put wood chip directly on the soil around the plant, we found very little vole damage. And I think the mechanism is that it falls down into the runs of the vole, and they don't like it. They don't like these bits of wood chip falling into where they want to go. So that's my instinct, but I don't have evidence for that, but that's my instinct. And I think it also, because they haven't got that permanent area of protection, they're more vulnerable probably to predators. And one of the things we noticed at the farm, almost within months of planting the trees, is the number of birds of prey just rocketed. Kestrels, barn owls, kites, buzzards, almost immediately. And that's almost, I think most of them are out looking for voles. So we have a lot of voles, but we actually had very little vole damage on the trees, which surprised me. But I think it's down to that wood chip. So that's mulching. So now I'm going to have a little look about what the benefits to the soil, because you have benefit effectively to the plant and to the plant growth, but the wood chip's also building soil health. And I mentioned Ian Tolhurst earlier. So for a number of years he's been adding composted wood chip to his soil, not in huge amounts, not as a mulch, but just as a soil amendment to boost soil health. And he's been growing on the site that he's on now for I think more than 30 years. And he's a vegan organic grower, so he uses no animal inputs, and he's been very innovative for decades with green manures and undersowing. So he's been looking after his soil about as well as you could look after it for a long time. But he says that when he started using wood chip, it sort of seemed to take his soil to another level. The productivity went up, the soil health went up. And I went to visit him about 4 or 5 years ago, and we walked into a field, and he told me that he'd put the wood chip addition on, I think a couple of months before we visited. And I looked down at the soil, and I couldn't find a bit of soil that wasn't a worm cast. It was entirely worm cast, and he's not on the best soil either. He's on, in the UK we have this classification system for soil, so he's on grade 3 soil, so not typical vegetable growing soil. But it was hard to find soil that wasn't a worm cast, and that was really striking. The picture here is that you can see it's actually not very well rotted wood chip. There's still quite big lumps of wood, and this is on a concrete pad, so the worms haven't even come up from the soil, and yet they're still finding their way in. So that surprised me as well, that you'd think it would take a while for worms to really want to be in amongst wood chip, but actually they come in pretty quickly, even where there's not soil. And we all know how wonderful worms are for the soil. So the other bit, and this is the bit that just blows my mind totally, and we still know so little relatively about, is the effect on fungi and the benefits of fungi. I think because we don't see most of the activity of fungi, we see the fruiting bodies, the mushrooms occasionally, but we don't really understand how it's all working. That it's only relatively recently that we've started to appreciate quite how amazing fungi are. And particularly when you look at wood and wood chip. So wood chip is mostly broken down by fungi rather than bacteria. And bacteria are not really strong enough to break into the woody lignin cells of wood chip. So that's why we're reliant on fungi. And fungi are able to function as well on much lower levels of nitrogen. than bacteria. They do need some nitrogen, but not so much. And this is, that's why even very old wood with almost no nitrogen really will eventually degrade, and they scavenge a bit of nitrogen from around them. And this is why you do occasionally get nitrogen robbing. So where wood touches the soil, it will suck a bit of nitrogen from the soil to help the fungi break down. Again, I haven't found a definitive answer, but it seems to be that it sucks nitrogen from about a centimetre, a half an inch from where it touches into the soil. So if you're mulching, it's actually only likely to have an effect in that very top layer of the soil. So for most plants, that's not going to have any detrimental impact at all. It can on some very shallow rooting plants. So I've had some problems, for instance, with raspberries where they're very shallow rooting, and that did seem to cause some problems. Or sometimes shallow rooting vegetables I wouldn't use fresh wood chip on, but mostly the concern about nitrogen robbing is overblown, I would say. But definitely don't dig in wood chip, and certainly not uncomposted wood chip or fresh wood chip. That's when you get the problem, because as soon as you dig it in, you've massively increased the area that wood chip is touching. If you leave it on the surface, it's only touching that top layer. And once you've got that composting wood chip and all that fungi in your soil, then what you're starting to do is shift the fungal ratio of your soil. And this is this concept that as soil forms, it starts on a volcanic rock. The first thing that comes in is bacteria that starts to break down the rock, and then you start getting very small plants, and then slightly woodier plants and bigger shrubs and trees. And as that soil ages, as it becomes more mature, the levels of fungi will increase. And trees mostly prefer a much more fungal dominated soil, whereas plants that are younger in that evolutionary journey will cope with a bacterial soil. And because particularly when we're cropping, so particularly vegetable growing or farming situations, we tend to be disturbing that soil or adding fungicides or things that will damage fungal population. So we're always trying to find ways to build back up that fungal population. And adding wood chip is a great way to do that. Not to mention the potential to sort of fix and sequester carbon. So as well as the carbon content of the wood itself, fungi are amazing at sequestering carbon, potentially as good as trees. So if you're building a habitat for fungi, you're also sucking carbon out of the air. So I mentioned this idea of nitrogen robbing, which I'm sure a lot of you know about anyway, the wood chip temporarily holds onto the nitrogen. So it sucks it up, and then as it breaks down, it releases it again. And you can actually then harness that potential. So while it is potentially a problem in some situations, you can use it to your advantage. So this picture here is a bioreactor in the States that's being used to control nitrogen runoff. So presumably this crop behind has had an application of nitrogen fertilizer, which is a relatively inexact science. So you tend to apply more than you need, and the risk then is that ends up running off into the waterway. So what they've done here, they've dug a big hole and they've filled it with wood chip, and that's going to suck up filter the water that's coming off the field and suck the nitrogen into the wood chip. And then occasionally they'll have to change the wood chip. I mean, that's, I would think there's probably other ways to solve that problem than digging a big hole, but it's interesting that they feel that's worth it. But even if you've got, manure or compost or even sort of lots of grass clippings, if you just leave that in a heap, you'll lose the nitrogen from that as it breaks down. Nitrogen's very soluble. It potentially will get leached out if you leave it uncovered. If you can mix it with wood chip, it effectively holds on to it for much longer. So whatever your source of nitrogen, it will hold on to, well, not just nitrogen, but other nutrients as well. So one study, for instance, looking at animal bedding using wood chip instead of straw, it showed that the wood chip bedding held on to a lot of nutrients for longer in the field and once it had been spread. So it can be a much more effective way of using available nutrients. So ramial chipped wood is something that I only came across when I was involved in this study I mentioned with the Organic Research Centre with Sally Westaway. So there was a study done in the 80s in Canada looking at this, and then nobody seemed to take that on until 40 years later when this other study was done. So there seems to be very little research, but ramial chipped wood is the wood from small branches, so branches that are less than 7 centimeters, 3 inches or so in diameter. They've got a much larger proportion of young green wood in them, which is obviously higher in nitrogen and other nutrients. And the potential benefit is you can just spread it straight on the soil. So this picture is about the amount of chip that they did in the trial that I was involved with. So it's not, it's not a mulch as such. It's a soil amendment instead, and it appears to bring benefits to soil health and potentially to soil carbon. I would say, there's much more research is needed, but the potential benefit is that you don't have to take it away and compost it and take it back. It's a much easier, quicker way of getting the benefits of using that wood chip than typical systems of composting and spreading. But there's definitely more research needed to really understand how to do it and when to do it. So, for instance, Ian Tolhurst again was one of the trialists in this trial, and he added his ramial chipped wood to a growing green manure crop, a cover crop. Whereas one of the other trialists was adding it directly to bare soil before planting. Both of them, or should I say, neither of them saw any negative effects from adding that, and they're going to be following some of the benefits as they go forward. So there's some quite good reports that have come out on that. But we need more. We need to know more. But it's really interesting, and it's a potential way, for instance, to deal with hedge trimmings. Or to deal with the bits that traditionally have been a waste product. So where there's, there might be timber or firewood or even biomass wood chip. There's often a bit that isn't good enough to go into that, and this could be a way of really harnessing the power that's in that bit of the wood chip. So I said I'd talk about hotbeds. Not my new range of electric blankets, but this is a way of harnessing the heat given off as wood chip compost. So this is Fred Bonestrew, who I mentioned before, and he has created using old pallets. So he just nails together some old pallets, fills it with fresh wood chip, and ideally fresh ramial wood chip. So you want a fairly good nitrogen content in there. And then as it rots down, it heats up, and you use that heat however you want. He uses it in his propagation bed. So this bit that he's lifting up here is a bit of perspex, and then he puts his plants on top of that. You could put it directly on the chip, but he actually found it almost got too hot on the chip, so he needed that layer just to insulate it against the heat. So hotbeds have been used for, centuries. The Romans were using them, but usually they would use manure. And what Fred has found is that the temperature from wood chip goes on longer and is more even than the manure. So manure gets a bit hotter and is quicker, whereas the wood chip lasts for longer. So it gives him 2-3 months of heat for his propagation. And again, there's other interesting things looking at, could you run hot water pipes through the wood chip and harness the power that way? So there's lots of ways of thinking about it. This is just a really simple method. You can set it up in the corner of your greenhouse or tunnel. Really effective. So this was the other thing that really blew my mind when I started researching it. I think Nick, had a question as well about how to use the wood chip for propagation compost. So again, you wouldn't think that taking something that is mostly carbon, you'd be able to turn it into something that you could sow seeds in. And what Tolle showed with his trial is actually you can make a really effective propagation compost from basically just wood chip. He does add a few bits right at the end for structure. So where he gets wood chip like we do at the farm, he gets wood chip from a tree surgeon. He mixes it with a little bit of his waste from the pack house where he runs his box scheme, but not much. It probably, I don't know, 5% of it would be that. Most of it would be the wood chip. He turns it 2 or 3 times during the season. So he's just got a little digger that he turns it over with. And then most of that gets spread on the soil, as I mentioned earlier, but a small proportion he keeps back and composts for a further 6 months. So it gets about 18 months of composting. And then he sieves it at the end and ends up with what just looks like a typical propagation substrate. In the trial that he did, which we were involved with him in, Innovative Farmers Field Lab trial, we tested it against a leading peat brand of propagation compost, and there was no difference in performance, which was quite startling, really. And there's the picture on the left here is some strawberries that he did. The trial was used leeks and lettuce, I think, that I can circulate details of that trial as well if people are interested. And the picture on the right actually is just some squashes planted into the pile of wood chip as it's rotting down. So even when you're dealing or processing the wood chip, you could still be growing stuff in it and making use of it. And there's, with the challenges of not using peat, as we harvest peat, we release massive carbon into the atmosphere, as well as destroy natural habitats. We need to be finding alternatives to peat, and wood chip compost could be one of those. And finally, no dig. Again, I won't go a lot into detail about no dig, but the basic principle is that rather than sort of digging and incorporating your organic matter, you add a layer to the top and let the soil biology do the work for you. Reduces damage to the soil, hopefully long-term increases soil health and reduces your weed burden. And wood chip can work really well in this instance. This particular example is a new bed that's being established in Scotland. It looks very fresh. It's ramial wood chip, so I'm not, I wouldn't be worried probably that's going to cause too much problems there. Putting it down, as you can see, there's snow on the ground, so they won't be doing anything with that for a couple of months anyway, so the wood chip will have started to rot down. There was a question about how my experience of wood chip differs from the Back to Eden method, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware of. And the answer is not very much, really. I mean, this effectively is very similar. My understanding of the Back to Eden, I'm not an expert on it, is that you have the layer of paper and then your layer of compost and then the wood chip on top, which is obviously a really effective way of doing it. I know quite a lot of people that just put cardboard and wood chip. Part of it will depend on how long you want to wait for the bed to be ready. If you're in a hurry, then certainly sort of adding compost will speed that process up a bit. It effectively kickstarts it with biology, whereas if you're just relying on the fungi, it will take longer. But it's a really, it's an effective way of reducing certainly weeds on the top and holding in moisture. There's potential risk of slugs and wood lice and some other pest pill bugs, but again, I don't think there's any method really that eliminates slugs. My experience using wood chip as a mulch is that I haven't seen a lot more slugs. It certainly hasn't eliminated them, but I haven't seen a lot more. Yeah, I mean, if you're not aware of Charles Dowding's work on no dig systems, then definitely follow that up, and he's got some experience of using wood chip as well. So, in summary, I hope you're all almost as enthused as me about woodchip. I'm not sure I'd recommend getting quite as my level of obsession, but you know, about how effective, you know, you can turn a tree into something that looks like that just through harnessing the power of fungi, basically, and bacteria. It's quite extraordinary. So thank you all very much. We do have 15 minutes for questions. Do buy the book, as Rosie said, from Chelsea Green. I've put the .com site, but there's the .co.uk one as well. And Rosie, I'm sure, will circulate, or you can buy direct from me if you want to. Check out the Facebook page that initially got set up as part of the ramial woodchip project, but that I now keep going, which is the Woodchip for Soil Health group, or do follow me on Twitter. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. That was very informative. We have loads of questions piling up here. So
Stop the share.
let's just jump in. First, a really quick one was Bren is wondering what the US site was called again that arranged for woodchip drop-offs.
Yes, and I didn't quite say it right, and I was aware as I was saying it that it wasn't quite right. And it's, so let me just quickly, because I've got it in here. Let me quickly find it. It's I think it's called something like Get Chip Drop.
Okay. We can also put it in the
yeah, www.getchipdrop.com.
Chip drop. Get chip drop. Okay. Hopefully that works. And then we have a question from Claire, who is wondering about using it as a sort of brown in the compost. So she says that often some pieces are not broken down when the rest of the compost is finished.
So just sieve them out and put them back into the compost heap is what I do. They will eventually break down, and they by the time they've sort of half composted, they're not doing any harm. So or you know, or what I sometimes do is just use those bits and chuck them on the soil or around a tree or something. But yeah, it is a great brown bit for compost. Definitely, it's a good addition, and it adds more structure than things like cardboard or paper, which break down very quickly. Whereas, you know, obviously you get some really big bits, which might be a problem, but even the smaller bits, they give a lighter compost, and you know, a better aerated compost than some of the other brown materials.
Great. Alan's wondering if cypress conifers make for more acidic mulch.
Yeah, and I think there was another question about pH as well, and so it's quite an interesting one. And the evidence I've seen is that even if the mulch is a bit acidic, it doesn't have much of an impact on soil, and certainly doesn't change the pH of a soil. The recommended mix seems to be for general use not to go more than about 30% conifer in a mix. But having said that, I think if you do have pure, you know, cypress or conifer or something, then actually you just leave it for longer. Eventually it will rot down. But I think it's because of the oils in it, it does take longer if it's on its own. So generally a mix is better if you can get hold of it. And certainly most free chip from tree surgeons will have quite a, well, I don't know, certainly in the UK will have quite a bit of sort of Leylandii and conifer in it, but that doesn't seem to cause a problem.
Okay, and that's sort of there's a related question about from Torvin. Do you have to be careful of having too many conifers? And if you want to compost it for use in propagation or as an amendment in vegetable beds, so is there a difference?
Yeah, so again, I wouldn't. I think if when you start using it in vegetables, it becomes, you know, you've got to be a bit more careful. So mulching for trees, you can get away with pretty much anything. I mean, not quite, but but when you start adding it to vegetables and annuals, you have to be a bit more careful. And I guess as a general rule, I would just say compost it for longer, and pretty much anything that's in it, once it's composted, you lose any harmful effects. So if you're at all worried, then just compost it for longer. And you'll be able to tell looking at it, if there's still lots of bits of conifer in there that haven't composted, then then it needs a bit more. And smell it, if it smells like a woodland, then it's not likely to do too much harm.
Claire's wondering if there is any risk of contamination from pollution. So if you're using wood chip from trees that were growing next to busy roads.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know is the short answer. I mean, there is clearly some trees are known for sucking pollution out of the air and are planted for that very reason. I suspect that the amount in the wood chip, which you're then spreading, is unlikely to cause much problem, but I don't have evidence for that. But I just think it's likely that it's going to be diluted, and then some of it gets locked up in the soil anyway. So biochar is another interesting thing I haven't covered tonight, which is the sort of burnt bit of wood, and that's really good at holding on to pollutants and sort of stopping them being absorbed by things. But yeah, I probably wouldn't be worried, but it would be interesting to see some research on that.
Do you have any advice? This is from Nat. Do you have any advice around using composted wood chip on pastures or using as an extract to spray on pastures?
Yeah, so this is something we want to do at Eastbrook, and the trials I've seen so far have mostly been on cropping systems. So one of the things we're planning to do with some of the rows that we've got at Eastbrook is to chip them and spread them straight on the grazing blocks in between the rows of trees. I think it will benefit, but I don't know of any trials that have looked at it. But yeah, if they're interested in trying it as well, I'd be interested to talk to them.
Right. Okay. Thank you. There's loads. We probably won't get to everyone's questions, but perhaps there are questions to be put towards the Facebook group as well if people want.
Yeah, absolutely. There's loads of knowledgeable people on the Facebook group. Tolly's quite active on it, so yeah.
One question from Jonathan is, can you use wood shavings collected as a byproduct of horse bedding instead of wood chip? Will it have the same effect?
So wood shavings and sawdust is interesting, and I would mostly say don't use them, or if you do, be really careful with them. So the problem with them is that they are from very old dry wood. So often the problems with nitrogen robbing have come from where people have used sawdust or wood shavings. So it's tiny particles, so it's got a much bigger surface area to rob nitrogen from, and it's from very old, very dry wood. So it's not that you can't use it, but you definitely need to compost it, and you definitely need to mix it with something with a bit of nitrogen in. Obviously, if it's horse bedding, it will have some nitrogen in. My experience of using horse manure is that because a lot of horse keepers are very fastidious, it tends to have a lot of wood shavings and not very much manure. So there's not a huge amount of nitrogen in there. And the other thing to be a little bit aware of with the horse particularly is a lot of horse keepers worm their horses constantly because they're so worried about worms. So that can have an effect on the compost and manure, and if you then add it all to your soil and it's not being properly composted and the worm has broken down, then you can end up killing a lot of the worms in your soil. So that's just another thing just to be aware of. But in principle, there's no reason why wood shavings and sawdust can't be used. You just have to treat it with a lot more caution than wood chip.
Great. And there was Rose had a question about your wood chip experiment at Eastbrook. So the trees that got 2 feet of mulch, were they not affected by the mulch against the trunk?
No, and I think it's because they were willow, and willow will root almost anywhere. So yes, I think other species it might well have caused a problem, and I'm definitely not recommending 2 feet of mulch necessarily, or certainly not in the way that we did it. But yeah, I think it was because it was willow, and as my as my old horticultural professor used to say, yeah, that will root in your pocket, that will.
Okay, and then in terms of, there's a question on, in terms of the performance of the composted wood chip versus peat propagation medium. So someone's interested in fungus gnats, and were they a problem at all? Because they found them problematic in peat-free propagation soils.
Right. So I don't know specifically about fungus gnats. That sounds American, which might be. So we do have scarred flies, which might be the same thing. I don't know. And we've certainly have seen that in some compost. We didn't see it in the wood chip. And I don't know whether that's because it was done outside and it was sort of biologically diverse. But yes, I mean, there's a reason why peat is being used so much. It's because it's sterile and clean and uniform, you know, and it's reliable. And moving away from that takes, you know, you do have to adjust and do things right. So clearly, things like that are could be a problem if the system isn't, you know, if the compost isn't well made. We didn't see it in that trial, but obviously aware that it can be a problem.
So here's quite a specific question from Pete. He says, we are going to be planting native broadleaf trees on pasture land, Italian ryegrass, which we believe is high in nitrogen due to previous heavy fertilization. Would fresh wood chip work well on this rather than composted wood chip?
I mean, this is getting a bit outside my area of expertise, I would say, but my guess is that even if you've got sort of historically highly fertilized land, you won't necessarily have loads of nitrogen in the soil because it's so soluble that it tends to get leached out, which isn't to say that adding the wood chip won't help, but I don't think you'll have kind of lots of sort of nitrogen sitting there waiting to be sucked up. I think it'll, you know, if it was over fertilized, it will have been lost. So I think the best thing to do is to build up the health of the soil by, you know, doing what you're suggesting. But yeah, I wouldn't probably do anything different to what I would do in a way in any situation. So potentially using the ramial or composted.
And Maggie's wondering what varieties of trees you would recommend planting to grow homemade ramial wood chip.
Well, so it kind of, I think the short answer is I don't know, because not enough research has been done into the differences. And one of the areas that really excites me about the future is the potential for single species wood chip and particular properties of a species. So, you know, the salicylic acid in willow that we did the trial with that seems to boost immunity in trees, you know, that's amazing. You know, and similarly, most trees are likely to have something in them that might be able to do something. So I think bearing in mind what you want the product for. So for instance, harder woods like, you know, oak or hornbeam will create a harder wood chip that lasts longer. So if you want to use it primarily as a long-lasting mulch, then you're better off growing oak than willow. You know, willow grows very quickly, you get loads of wood chip, but it rots down quite quickly because it's quite soft. Or, you know, if you specifically want to try and harness the power of salicylic acid, then then willow is great. If you want to fix nitrogen, then alder's, you know, a good crop. So I think you know, the chip from pretty much any tree is going to be useful. So it's thinking about your primary purpose for growing it, or, you know, or thinking about what other uses it might have. You know, if you have livestock, then the fact that they can browse willow is also really good. So, you know, it might not just be about the wood chip, it might be about what else it brings to your system.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ben. I think we're gonna leave it there. And sorry, there's a few questions we haven't answered, but we're at the hour mark. So yeah, just to remind people, you can get 35% off Ben's book, which is full of more info about wood chip. So you can use, yeah, the code web35, and I'll share that in a follow-up email as well. But thanks so much, Ben, for sharing your knowledge, and thanks everyone for joining, and hope everyone has a good evening.
Thank you all, and thanks Rosie for organising.